Sometimes the biggest mistake isn't breaking down the wrong door. It's believing you already know who lives behind it. At exactly 5:17 a.m., the quiet suburban street in Charlotte, North Carolina, was swallowed by flashing blue lights reflecting across dew-covered lawns and silent bedroom windows. Neighbors peeked through their curtains as nearly 30 police officers, tactical vehicles, and marked cruisers lined both sides of the narrow road, turning an ordinary Saturday morning into something that felt impossible to explain. Radios crackled with clipped commands. Boots moved across damp concrete with disciplined precision. Every officer had been briefed before sunrise. The woman inside the modest white house at the end of the cul-de-sac had been identified as a potential threat connected to an active federal investigation. No one questioned the intelligence. No one expected surprises. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper adjusted the microphone clipped to his vest and looked toward the command vehicle where Police Chief Daniel Carter studied the digital floor plan glowing on a tablet. "Perimeter is secure," Ryan reported. "No movement inside." Daniel nodded without taking his eyes off the screen. "Execute the warrant. Stay professional. We do this by the book." Around him, officers checked equipment one final time before moving into position. The neighborhood remained eerily still except for a gentle breeze that stirred an American flag hanging from the front porch of the small home. It looked nothing like the hideout everyone had imagined during the briefing. Flower pots lined the walkway. A weathered rocking chair sat beside the front door. Wind chimes whispered softly under the porch roof. Everything about the place suggested quiet routines instead of danger. Yet the address matched the warrant exactly. Daniel stepped onto the sidewalk and looked at the house himself. Something felt strangely ordinary. A bicycle belonging to one of the neighborhood kids leaned against the fence as though someone had forgotten to pick it up the afternoon before. Fresh birdseed covered a small feeder hanging beneath an oak tree. A handwritten chalk message on the driveway read, "Have a beautiful day." Daniel frowned for only a second before pushing the feeling aside. Intelligence reports didn't care about flower gardens or kind messages. Facts were facts. At least that was what years of police work had taught him. Across the street, an elderly couple stood quietly on their porch wrapped in robes, watching with anxious expressions. One whispered, "Miss Naomi? That can't be right." Another neighbor slowly shook his head, but said nothing as more officers surrounded the property. Inside the house, however, there were no hurried footsteps, no sounds of panic, no attempt to flee. The home remained completely silent. Ryan glanced at Daniel again. "Chief, she's not reacting." Daniel looked toward the front windows where warm golden light glowed faintly through linen curtains. "Maybe she's waiting," he answered. Seconds later, the lead team approached the entrance. A loud announcement echoed through the cool morning air identifying the officers and ordering anyone inside to come to the door. Silence answered back. The command was repeated. Again, nothing. Daniel checked his watch. Every passing second made the tension heavier. Finally, he gave one small nod. The officers entered the home according to procedure, moving quickly but carefully through the quiet living room. What they found was not chaos, not evidence of a criminal operation, but something so completely unexpected that the momentum of the entire operation seemed to disappear. Standing calmly near a bookshelf with a steaming mug of coffee resting on a coaster, Naomi Brooks looked at the officers without fear, without anger, and without surprise. Her voice was steady as morning sunlight. "Before you search another room," she said gently, "Chief, you may want to look at the wall behind you." Daniel Carter turned slowly, expecting family photographs or graduation certificates. Instead, his eyes landed on a single framed identification displayed with quiet dignity, and in that instant, every trace of color drained from his face. Daniel Carter did not blink for several long seconds. The framed identification hanging neatly above the fireplace was not decorative memorabilia or an old workplace certificate. It carried the unmistakable seal of a federal intelligence agency, preserved behind crystal-clear glass alongside a letter signed years earlier by the Attorney General of the United States. Beneath it rested a simple bronze service medal, polished but unassuming, and next to that stood a photograph of Naomi Brooks shaking hands with officials whose faces Daniel recognized instantly from national news broadcasts. The room became so quiet that he could hear the faint ticking of a small clock resting on a nearby bookshelf. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper stepped closer, expecting to understand what had frozen his chief in place, but Daniel instinctively raised one hand, silently signaling everyone to stop where they were. Naomi remained exactly where she had been standing, both hands wrapped around her coffee mug. Steam drifted upward in slow curls, filling the room with the comforting scent of fresh roasted coffee. She did not appear frightened. She did not appear angry. More than anything, she looked disappointed. Her modest living room reflected the same quiet dignity as the woman herself. Every shelf was organized. Children's books filled one corner beside a reading lamp. Family photographs showed birthdays, graduations, neighborhood picnics, and smiling faces gathered beneath summer sunshine. A small basket near the fireplace overflowed with handwritten thank you cards decorated by elementary school students. One card, written in uneven blue crayon, simply read, "Thank you, Miss Naomi, for helping me love reading." Daniel slowly looked around the room, noticing details he had ignored during the urgency of the operation. There were no expensive decorations, no signs of hidden wealth, no indication that this woman lived any differently from thousands of ordinary Americans. A folded volunteer schedule rested on the dining table beside a stack of library books waiting to be returned. A pair of reading glasses lay carefully atop an open mystery novel. Fresh flowers brightened the kitchen window overlooking the backyard. The house felt lived in, peaceful, and welcoming. Ryan lowered his voice. "Chief, who is she?" Daniel swallowed before answering. "I'm not sure anymore." Naomi finally broke the silence. "Would you like to sit down before we continue?" Her calmness unsettled several officers more than any raised voice could have. One young patrol officer shifted uneasily, glancing toward the broken front entrance and then back to the woman whose morning had been interrupted without warning. She gently placed her mug on the coaster and walked toward a small wooden cabinet near the hallway. Every movement was slow and deliberate, giving everyone in the room confidence that she intended no confrontation. She opened a drawer and removed a neatly organized folder. "I keep copies of everything," she said softly. "Old habits are difficult to leave behind." Daniel accepted the folder carefully. Inside were retirement documents, commendations, volunteer records, and community awards spanning nearly 2 decades. The most recent papers identified Naomi not as an active federal employee, but as the coordinator of literacy programs serving children throughout Mecklenburg County. Every weekend, she organized free reading sessions at neighborhood parks. During the school year, she mentored students struggling with reading comprehension. She had quietly devoted years to helping families without asking for recognition. Daniel felt an uncomfortable weight settle across his shoulders. He remembered the briefing only an hour earlier. The file presented to his command staff had described a dangerous suspect connected to classified activity. Yet the woman standing before him looked nothing like the person outlined in those reports. She looked like the kind neighbor every community hoped to have. Outside, flashing lights continued reflecting across the windows while curious neighbors remained gathered behind yellow police tape. Inside, however, certainty had begun slipping away. Daniel realized that the operation everyone believed would end with an arrest had instead become the beginning of questions no one in the room was prepared to answer. No one spoke for nearly half a minute. The silence inside Naomi Brooks's living room felt heavier than the dozens of voices that had filled the street only moments earlier. Chief Daniel Carter carefully closed the folder and looked once more at the framed federal identification on the wall. Something about the dates immediately caught his attention. Naomi had retired almost 9 years earlier, long before he became chief of police. If the documents were authentic, and every instinct told him they were, then the intelligence briefing that launched this operation had relied on information that was dangerously outdated. Daniel reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder, but stopped before pressing the button. He needed facts before he said another word. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper watched his chief with growing concern. He had worked beside Daniel for nearly 12 years and knew the subtle signs. Daniel only became this quiet when something had gone terribly wrong. "Chief," Ryan said carefully, "should I continue clearing the house?" Daniel slowly shook his head. No one opens another cabinet. No one touches another room. Several officers immediately lowered their hands and stepped back from the hallway. Naomi appreciated the gesture, but said nothing. Instead, she walked toward the kitchen and quietly filled a kettle with water. The soft sound of running water somehow made the room feel even more ordinary. She glanced over her shoulder with the same calm expression she had worn since the officers entered. Would anyone like coffee? It may be a long morning. The offer surprised nearly everyone. One young officer looked down at the hardwood floor, clearly embarrassed. Another quietly removed his cap. Outside, neighbors continued watching from behind the police tape as local television vans slowly arrived after hearing radio traffic about a large police operation. Daniel finally pressed his radio. Dispatch, connect me directly to the State Intelligence Fusion Center. Priority line. The response came immediately. Stand by, Chief. Less than 20 seconds later, another voice answered. Daniel introduced himself and requested immediate verification of Naomi Brooks's status. There was a brief pause before the analyst replied. Chief Carter, where did you get that name? Daniel looked toward Naomi before answering. I am standing in her living room. The silence on the other end lasted even longer this time. Finally, the analyst spoke again, slower than before. Please remain where you are. Do not make any additional decisions until someone from our office contacts you. Daniel frowned. Is there a problem? Chief, I cannot discuss this over an unsecured line. The connection ended. Ryan had heard enough of the conversation to recognize that this situation had become far more complicated than a mistaken address. That did not sound good, he admitted quietly. Daniel slipped the radio back onto his shoulder without answering. Instead, he walked toward the bookshelf beneath the framed identification. Among dozens of novels and biographies sat several photo albums. One was slightly open. Without removing it from the shelf, he noticed photographs of Naomi reading to children inside the public library, visiting veterans at a nursing home, organizing food drives after severe storms, and standing beside smiling volunteers wearing matching community service shirts. Every image told the same story. This woman had spent years serving others without seeking attention. None of it matched the profile presented during the briefing before dawn. Naomi returned carrying a simple wooden tray with coffee cups. I know questions are coming, she said softly. I only hope whoever answers them chooses honesty. Daniel accepted the cup almost automatically. The warmth spread through his hands, but it did nothing to settle the growing unease in his chest. Somewhere between the briefing room and this quiet living room, the truth had been replaced by something else, and for the first time that morning, he began wondering whether the real target of the investigation had never been Naomi Brooks at all. The kettle whistled softly before Naomi turned off the stove and poured hot water into another coffee cup as though unexpected visitors had always been part of her morning routine. Outside, the flashing emergency lights continued to color the curtains blue and red, but inside the house the atmosphere had changed completely. Nobody reached for handcuffs anymore. Nobody searched another drawer. Every officer seemed to be waiting for someone else to explain how an operation that had begun with absolute confidence had dissolved into uncertainty within minutes. Daniel Carter stood near the front window, watching reporters gather beyond the police barricade. More patrol cars had arrived to manage traffic, and curious residents now lined both sidewalks. He knew the longer this scene continued, the more attention it would attract. Before he could speak again, his secure phone vibrated. The screen displayed a restricted federal number. Daniel answered immediately. Chief Carter. A calm voice replied. Chief, this is Deputy Director Evelyn Harris with the Federal Intelligence Oversight Office. Are you alone? Daniel glanced around the room. No, ma'am. My command staff is present. Then put me on speaker. Daniel hesitated only briefly before following the instruction. The room fell silent once again. Chief Carter, the woman continued. I need you to answer one question before we proceed. Is Miss Naomi Brooks safe? Daniel looked directly at Naomi. She stood quietly beside the dining table, both hands resting gently on the back of a wooden chair. Yes, ma'am. She is safe. There was a noticeable pause before Evelyn Harris spoke again. Thank you. That is the most important thing. Several officers exchanged confused looks. Ryan Cooper slowly folded his arms, realizing they had entered territory far beyond a local investigation. Daniel cleared his throat. Ma'am, our department received an authorized warrant tied to an active intelligence report. We were informed that this address belonged to an individual connected to a classified case. I know exactly what your department received, Evelyn answered. And I also know that report should never have reached your office. Daniel felt the weight in his chest grow heavier. Then this was a mistake? No, Chief. Mistakes happen by accident. What you are describing appears to be something else. Nobody moved. Even the officers nearest the doorway remained completely still. Evelyn continued carefully. Naomi Brooks retired from federal service with full honors. Her identity remained inside several protected government databases because portions of her previous assignments are still classified. That information cannot legally be used as probable cause in any civilian investigation. Someone bypassed multiple safeguards. Daniel lowered his eyes. Are you saying someone intentionally directed us here? That is exactly what I am saying. Naomi finally spoke for the first time since the call began. Her voice remained gentle, almost compassionate. I wondered how long it would take before someone realized. Daniel turned toward her. You expected this? Naomi slowly nodded. Not this exact morning. But I knew eventually someone would come asking questions that had nothing to do with the life I have lived for years. Evelyn responded immediately. Miss Brooks, I am sincerely sorry. Naomi smiled faintly. You do not owe me an apology, Director Harris. Someone else does. The words were never spoken with anger. They carried only quiet truth. Daniel felt every officer in the room glance toward him, yet Naomi never looked at him with accusation. Instead, she walked to a nearby cabinet and gently picked up a worn leather scrapbook. She placed it carefully on the dining table before opening the first page. Inside were newspaper clippings celebrating community literacy programs, photographs of neighborhood children proudly holding their first library cards, letters from military families thanking her for tutoring their sons and daughters during deployments, and dozens of handwritten notes expressing gratitude. She looked at Daniel with calm eyes that revealed neither bitterness nor pride. Chief, she said softly, this is the only identity I have wanted anyone to remember for almost a decade. Whatever someone was searching for this morning, they were looking for a woman who no longer exists. It was only after the secure call ended that the true weight of the morning finally settled over the room. Chief Daniel Carter slowly lowered the phone from his hand, but his eyes remained fixed on Naomi Brooks. Every assumption he had carried into her home before sunrise had quietly collapsed, replaced by a growing realization that the people standing inside this peaceful house were no longer investigating a suspect. They had become witnesses to a failure much larger than themselves. Outside, the steady hum of television helicopters drifted across the neighborhood, mixing with the distant voices of reporters gathering behind the police barricades. Inside, however, the only sound came from the old wall clock marking each passing second with gentle precision. Daniel looked toward Lieutenant Ryan Cooper. Call everyone back from the property line, he said calmly. No photographs. No interviews. Nobody speaks to the press. Ryan nodded immediately and stepped outside to relay the order. Within minutes, officers quietly lowered the yellow tape while patrol units repositioned themselves farther from the house. Curious neighbors continued watching from their front yards, confused by the sudden change in posture. Moments earlier, the operation had projected complete certainty. Now every movement carried hesitation. Daniel remained standing beside the dining table, staring at the scrapbook Naomi had opened before him. He slowly turned another page. There were photographs of elementary school reading competitions, holiday food drives, veterans learning computer skills, and children proudly holding certificates after completing summer literacy programs. Hundreds of smiling faces filled the pages. One newspaper clipping described Naomi as the quiet volunteer who had helped thousands of children improve their reading over the past decade. Another recognized her for organizing free tutoring sessions every Saturday morning without accepting compensation. Daniel quietly whispered, almost to himself, "You built an entirely different life." Naomi smiled gently. That was always the plan. She closed the scrapbook with both hands and looked toward the sunlight spilling through the kitchen window. When I retired, I promised myself that the most important thing I would ever protect again would not be classified information. It would be hope. Those words lingered in the room long after she finished speaking. Daniel found himself unable to answer. Years of police work had taught him to read people quickly, to identify deception, to separate performance from sincerity. Yet nothing about Naomi required analysis. Her peace felt genuine because it had been earned. His phone vibrated again. This time the message came directly from the Federal Intelligence Oversight Office. Only 4 words appeared across the secure screen. Do not leave location. Seconds later, another message arrived containing a single attachment marked priority. Daniel opened the encrypted document. His breathing slowed almost immediately. The report confirmed what Director Evelyn Harris had already suspected. Someone inside a restricted government database had deliberately reactivated Naomi Brooks's classified personnel profile less than 48 hours earlier. The modification had automatically triggered a series of outdated security alerts before being forwarded through multiple agencies until it eventually reached the Charlotte Police Department. The chain of events looked official on paper. In reality, every step had been carefully engineered. Daniel felt the back of his neck tighten. This had never been an accidental paperwork error. Someone had wanted 30 police officers standing inside this exact living room. Someone had expected Naomi Brooks to become the center of a public spectacle. He slowly looked around the room again. The broken front entrance. The frightened neighbors. The television crews waiting outside. None of it happened by chance. Naomi watched his expression change before quietly asking, "You know now, do not you?" Daniel met her eyes. "Yes." She nodded softly, almost as if she had expected that answer all along. "Then whoever started this was never trying to find me." Daniel looked back at the classified report, still glowing on his phone. Every instinct he possessed told him the same thing. This morning had never been about arresting Naomi Brooks. It had been about destroying the reputation of a woman whose greatest decision had been to quietly disappear, and somewhere beyond the cameras waiting outside, the person responsible was almost certainly watching to see whether their plan had worked. The morning slowly lost its urgency, but it did not lose its weight. One by one, the patrol cars pulled farther away from the curb, leaving only a handful of command vehicles in front of Naomi Brooks's home. The flashing lights disappeared, replaced by the soft glow of early sunlight spreading across the quiet neighborhood. Birds that had scattered during the commotion gradually returned to the oak tree in her front yard, landing near the small feeder she filled every morning. The ordinary sounds of life cautiously reclaimed the street. Children waiting for weekend soccer practice whispered to their parents, while neighbors exchanged uncertain glances from their porches. Inside the house, nobody rushed to speak. Chief Daniel Carter stood near the broken entrance, studying the damaged door that now leaned awkwardly against the wall. Splintered wood rested across the welcome mat, where someone had carefully painted the words, "Kindness lives here." Daniel stared at the message for several long seconds. He wondered whether he had stepped across those words without noticing them when he entered earlier that morning. Naomi quietly gathered a dustpan and began sweeping small pieces of wood from the hardwood floor. She did not complain. She did not sigh. She simply cleaned her home the same way she had likely cleaned countless small messes throughout her life. Daniel instinctively stepped forward. "Miss Brooks, please let one of my officers do that." Naomi looked up with a gentle smile. "Thank you, Chief. But cleaning has never embarrassed me. It reminds me that broken things can still become whole again." Her answer lingered in the room like warm light filtering through the kitchen window. Several officers lowered their eyes. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper quietly accepted a broom from a nearby closet without saying a word. Another officer carefully moved a bookshelf away from the doorway so the floor could be swept properly. No orders were given. Nobody asked permission. They simply began helping. The atmosphere no longer resembled an investigation. It resembled neighbors repairing the home of someone they had accidentally wronged. Outside, one of the television reporters attempted to approach the property, but another officer politely redirected the cameras away from the front porch. Daniel had already instructed every member of his department that no images of Naomi's home would be released. Her privacy would remain protected. Naomi carried a small tray of fresh coffee onto the dining table once more. "Please," she said softly, "sit while it is still warm." Even after everything that had happened, she continued treating everyone with quiet courtesy. Daniel accepted the invitation. As he looked around the room again, he noticed something he had overlooked before. Hanging beside the family photographs was a simple wooden frame containing a handwritten quote. The ink had faded with age, but every word remained clear. "People will remember how safe they felt in your presence long after they forget your accomplishments." Daniel read it twice before asking, "Who wrote that?" Naomi looked toward the frame with quiet affection. "My grandmother. She raised me to believe that respect is something you give before you expect to receive it." Daniel nodded slowly. Those words settled deep inside him. Throughout his career, he had measured success by solved cases, promotions, commendations, and public trust. Yet sitting inside this modest home, surrounded by children's drawings and shelves filled with library books, he realized that Naomi had built something far more lasting than recognition. She had built peace. The room remained quiet again, but this silence no longer carried confusion. It carried reflection. Beyond the open doorway, sunlight stretched across the repaired neighborhood like the beginning of an ordinary day, while inside, every officer present understood that the greatest lesson of the morning had nothing to do with classified files or federal investigations. It had begun with a woman who chose dignity over resentment, grace over anger, and kindness even toward those who had arrived believing the worst about her. It was nearly 9 o'clock when another black government sedan rolled quietly onto the street. Unlike the television vans parked beyond the intersection, this vehicle carried no markings and attracted almost no attention from the curious crowd. A woman in a charcoal gray suit stepped out, carrying nothing except a slim leather portfolio. Chief Daniel Carter recognized her immediately from official conferences years earlier. Deputy Director Evelyn Harris had come in person. The moment she reached the front porch, she extended her hand toward Naomi Brooks before speaking to anyone else. "It is good to see you again." Naomi smiled warmly. "It has been a long time, Evelyn." The familiarity between the two women surprised every officer standing nearby. Evelyn entered the living room and quietly looked around at the damaged doorway before letting out a slow breath. "I wish this meeting had happened under different circumstances." Naomi simply nodded. Daniel closed the front door behind them, leaving the reporters and neighbors outside. Evelyn placed her portfolio on the dining table and removed a sealed folder stamped with multiple federal security markings. She looked directly at Daniel. "Chief Carter, you deserve the complete truth." Daniel listened without interrupting. Evelyn opened the folder and slid a single photograph across the table. It showed Naomi nearly 15 years earlier wearing a federal credential around her neck while standing beside dozens of rescue personnel outside a damaged government building. Daniel leaned closer. Something about the image felt strangely familiar. Evelyn continued. "Most people believe that operation ended because of advanced intelligence technology. That was never the full story." She turned another page. This time there were official commendations signed by cabinet officials, military leaders, and federal judges. Every document carried Naomi's name. Miss Brooks led the analytical team that identified a hidden communications pattern no one else recognized. Her work prevented multiple coordinated attacks and allowed emergency responders to evacuate hundreds of federal employees before they were placed in danger. The operation remained classified for years because revealing her role would have exposed ongoing intelligence methods. Daniel slowly looked back at Naomi. She lowered her eyes, almost shyly, as though the conversation belonged to someone else entirely. Evelyn smiled gently. She never asked for recognition. In fact, she requested that her name remain confidential after retirement. Daniel felt a strange memory begin forming in the back of his mind. He reached for another photograph inside the folder. There, standing among dozens of officers celebrating the successful operation, was a much younger version of himself. He stared at the picture before suddenly freezing. "Wait." His voice became almost a whisper. "I was there." Evelyn nodded. "Yes, you were." Daniel continued studying the image until he finally found Naomi standing several rows behind the uniformed officers, almost hidden from the cameras. "I remember that day," he said quietly. "We were told an anonymous intelligence team had redirected the evacuation minutes before everything changed." Evelyn answered softly. That anonymous team was Naomi Brooks. The room fell silent once again. Daniel's heartbeat seemed louder than the ticking clock on the wall. Years earlier, he had accepted a departmental medal connected to that operation, believing countless unnamed analysts had contributed equally. He had never imagined the quiet woman now serving coffee in a neighborhood library had been the person whose judgment made the entire rescue possible. Naomi finally broke the silence. "None of those people knew my face. That was intentional." Daniel looked at her with genuine disbelief. "Including me." She smiled kindly. "Including you." Evelyn carefully closed the folder. "Chief, there is one more thing you should know. The individual responsible for reactivating Naomi's classified identity also accessed archived records from that operation. Whoever orchestrated today's events knew exactly who she was. This was never random. Daniel slowly lowered himself into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the realization. The woman many people now recognized only as Miss Naomi from the public library had once quietly protected lives across the country, including his own, and she had chosen to spend the years afterward teaching children how to read instead of reminding the world what she had accomplished. The truth settled over the room with remarkable gentleness. There was no dramatic celebration, no triumphant speech, only a quiet understanding that every person standing inside Naomi Brooks's home had been changed by what they had learned. Chief Daniel Carter slowly rose from his chair and looked around the living room one final time before turning toward Naomi. The damaged doorway, the scattered repair tools, the framed photographs of smiling children, and the handwritten thank you cards suddenly felt far more important than any metal or classified document he had seen that morning. He removed his police cap and held it respectfully at his side. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice steady but unmistakably sincere. "During my career, I have apologized to people when procedures failed. Today, I need to apologize because I failed." Naomi listened without interrupting. Daniel continued, "I walked into your home believing a report instead of remembering that every investigation begins with the responsibility to see people clearly. My officers followed lawful orders, but I was responsible for those orders. I am sorry for bringing fear into a home that has spent years bringing peace to this community." The room remained completely still. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper quietly lowered his head while several officers stood silently behind their chief. Naomi looked at each of them before finally answering. "Chief Carter, accountability matters. That is why your words matter." Daniel nodded, waiting for whatever came next. She stepped toward the broken entrance and rested one hand against the damaged frame. "This door can be replaced. Wood is easy to repair." Then she gently placed her other hand over her heart. "The harder work is making certain people do not carry invisible doors inside themselves. Doors that close before they know someone. Doors built from assumptions instead of understanding." No one spoke. Even Deputy Director Evelyn Harris remained silent, allowing Naomi's words to settle naturally over the room. After a long pause, Daniel asked quietly, "What can I do to begin making this right?" Naomi smiled with the same warmth that had welcomed neighborhood children into her library programs for years. "Do not make today about me." Daniel looked surprised. She continued, "If this becomes only a story about one woman, then nothing truly changes. Use today to remind every officer under your leadership that a badge carries authority, but humility is what earns trust. Teach them to slow down before deciding who someone is. Teach them that dignity belongs to every person they meet, long before any file or database tells them otherwise." Daniel felt those words settle deeper than any leadership seminar or professional training he had ever attended. He looked toward the officers gathered around the room. Every one of them was listening with complete attention. Ryan finally spoke. "Chief, she is right." Daniel nodded. "She is." Deputy Director Harris closed her portfolio and smiled quietly. "Miss Brooks has been teaching people her entire life. Apparently, retirement never changed that." A soft laugh moved through the room, easing the tension that had lingered since dawn. Naomi laughed as well, shaking her head gently. "Old habits are difficult to leave behind." Daniel extended his hand. Naomi accepted it without hesitation. The handshake lasted only a moment, yet everyone present understood its meaning. It was not simply forgiveness. It was an invitation to become better than they had been only hours earlier. Outside, neighbors watched as officers quietly began helping contractors measure the damaged doorway, while others carried away broken pieces of wood. There were no raised voices, no cameras pointed toward Naomi's face, and no attempt to defend what had happened. There was only honest effort. Standing in the sunlight pouring through the open entrance, Daniel realized that the greatest act of leadership he would perform that day would not be giving another command. It would be leaving Naomi Brooks's home carrying her lesson instead of his pride. 1 month later, the maple trees along Naomi Brooks's street were beginning to wear the first colors of autumn. The broken doorway had long since been replaced with a sturdy oak door that looked almost identical to the original, except for one small difference. Mounted beside the brass handle was a simple bronze plaque that read, "With respect for a neighbor who reminded us that character deserves to be seen before judgment." Naomi had never asked for the plaque. In fact, she had suggested more than once that it was unnecessary. But the officers who returned to install it insisted that some lessons should remain visible. Every Saturday morning, the community library welcomed another group of children eager for story hour. Their laughter echoed between the bookshelves as Naomi sat in her familiar reading chair with an illustrated novel resting gently in her hands. To the children, she was simply Miss Naomi, the woman who always remembered every name, every favorite book, and every dream they shared with her. They knew nothing about classified files, federal service, or the events of that unforgettable morning. Naomi preferred it that way. Across town, Chief Daniel Carter stood before every sworn officer in the Charlotte Police Department during a mandatory leadership seminar unlike any the department had held before. There were no slides filled with statistics, no discussion of arrest numbers or department awards. Instead, the first image projected onto the large screen showed a weathered welcome mat with 4 simple words. Kindness lives here. Daniel allowed the room to remain silent before speaking. Every decision we make begins before we ever knock on a door. It begins with how we choose to see the person on the other side. No names were mentioned. No confidential details were revealed. Yet everyone present understood that their chief was sharing the most important lesson of his career. New training standards soon followed, placing greater emphasis on verification, communication, and treating every resident with dignity regardless of appearance, neighborhood, or first impressions. The changes spread beyond one department. Other agencies requested copies of the new program, and what began inside a quiet living room slowly influenced conversations across the state. Meanwhile, the federal investigation uncovered the individual responsible for manipulating the protected records that had triggered the entire operation. The deception was exposed through lawful procedures, and the false information was removed from every affected database. Deputy Director Evelyn Harris personally informed Naomi that her name had once again been fully protected. Naomi thanked her with the same quiet grace she showed everyone else before returning to the library in time for the afternoon reading session. Life, at least the life she had chosen, continued exactly as she hoped. Late one afternoon, Daniel stopped by the library carrying a cardboard box filled with brand new children's books purchased through a community donation campaign organized by the police department. He quietly placed the box beside Naomi's desk. "I thought these belonged here more than anywhere else." Naomi smiled warmly. "The children will love them." Daniel looked around at the bright reading room where children sat cross-legged on colorful rugs, completely absorbed in stories about courage, friendship, and kindness. He smiled back. "I think they already have the best story sitting in front of them." Naomi laughed softly and gently opened the first new book. Outside the library windows, golden sunlight settled across the sidewalks while families walked home beneath the turning leaves. Inside, a room full of young voices listened as Miss Naomi began another story, never mentioning the remarkable chapters of her own life. She did not need to. The greatest legacy she left behind was never hidden inside classified files or framed certificates on a wall. It lived quietly in every child she encouraged, every neighbor she welcomed, every officer who learned to lead with humility, and every person who discovered that true strength is not measured by power, but by the kindness that remains even after every reason to withhold it.